There are moments that define us, moments that etch themselves into the bedrock of our identity. They are rarely the loud, celebrated victories that come with trophies and applause. More often, they are the quiet, terrifying moments of decision, when we are standing alone, armed with nothing but a promise, facing a world of doubt and ridicule. This is a story about one of those moments. It's about a young girl who made a promise to her father. A promise that everyone in her world called a foolish, dangerous, childish dream. It's about a legendary horse that no one on earth could ride, and the deafening, cruel laughter of a crowd that was about to be silenced forever. The air at the Oakley County Rodeo was thick with a potent, familiar cocktail of scents. The dry, kicked-up dust of the arena, the rich, worn smell of saddle leather, and the sharp, unmistakable tang of arrogant laughter. And on this sweltering Saturday afternoon, all of it was directed at 16-year-old Lila. She stood alone near the registration tent, a small, determined island in a sea of pointing fingers and disbelieving whispers. Just moments before, she had done the unthinkable, the unimaginable. She had walked with a steady, determined stride into the registrar's office, her chin held high, and signed her name on the entry form for the rodeo's main event, the Wild Horse Race. And next to her name, in the space reserved for the horse, she had written a name that sent a shockwave of disbelief and mockery through the entire rodeo ground. Tempest. Tempest wasn't just any horse. He was a living, breathing, terrifying local legend, and he was her father's horse. Her late father, John Ryder, had been a titan, the greatest rodeo champion the county had ever seen, a man whose name was still spoken with a mixture of reverence and awe. And Tempest, a massive, untamable black stallion, was his final, unfinished masterpiece. The horse was a force of nature, a symphony of contradictions. He was breathtakingly beautiful, with a powerful athletic build and a coat as dark as a starless midnight sky. He was fiercely intelligent, his eyes holding a deep, knowing fire. But he was also possessed by a wild, unpredictable, and violent spirit that no one had been able to contain since John's death. After John was killed in a tragic car accident a year prior, a light had gone out in Tempest. The horse who had been a willing, brilliant partner for one man became an untouchable storm for all others. In the year since the accident, Tempest had become a cautionary tale. He had thrown, injured, and terrorized every seasoned cowboy and professional trainer who had dared to enter his pen. He was deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, a beautiful but broken relic of a champion's legacy. He was now just a memory, locked away in a high-walled pen at the back of the Ryder Ranch, a symbol of a greatness that could never be recaptured. So when the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, and in a surprise last-minute entry for the main event, we have Lila Ryder riding Tempest. A wave of stunned silence was followed by a tidal wave of cruel, open laughter. It rippled through the crowd of weathered ranchers, hardened cowboys, and their families. It was a sound that was sharp and dismissive. "John's little girl?" One grizzled old rancher scoffed to his friends, a look of pity and contempt on his face. "She's just a kid. She'll be lucky to get near him, let alone get a saddle on him." Another man, a rival of her father's, laughed loudly. "She's going to get herself killed. What is she thinking? It's a disgrace to her father's memory, letting a child try to tame that monster." The comments were like stones, thrown from every direction. They called her foolish, arrogant, a child playing a deadly game. The laughter was a physical blow, each chuckle a sting, each guffaw a punch to her gut. But Lila stood tall, her small frame rigid, her jaw set in a line of defiance. They didn't understand. None of them did. This wasn't about winning a race. It wasn't about prize money or a trophy. It was about a promise, a sacred pact made in the quiet of a moonlit night. The night before her father died, he had found her in the barn, crying. She was overwhelmed by the constant pressure of living in his giant shadow, of the expectation that she, too, would be a champion. He had knelt down in the straw, his presence always so much larger than life, and had wiped away her tears with his calloused thumb. "Lila," he had said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Greatness isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's not about winning every time. It's about having the heart to try when everyone else in the world says you can't. It's about listening when everyone else is shouting. He had then looked over at Tempest, who was watching them from his stall with soft, intelligent eyes. That horse, he understands. He's got more heart than any animal I've ever known. One day you'll ride him, not with force, not with a whip or spurs. You'll ride him with this, he said, gently tapping her chest, right over her heart. You'll ride him with understanding, and on that day, you'll show them all what real heart looks like. It was the last real conversation she ever had with him. Now standing alone amidst the storm of ridicule, her father's words were the only voice she could hear. A quiet, steady anchor in a sea of noise. She wasn't just a competitor signing up for a race. She was a daughter, keeping her final, most important promise. The crowd saw a foolish, fragile little girl playing dress-up in her father's world. She was about to step into that arena and show them a champion's daughter. The laughter would not be the last sound they made. As Lila began her long, lonely walk from the registration tent toward the high-walled holding pen at the far end of the rodeo grounds, a tangible shift occurred in the atmosphere. The loud, boisterous laughter began to die down, replaced by a morbid, watchful curiosity. The crowd parted for her as she walked, creating a silent corridor. People who had been openly mocking her just moments before now simply stared. Their faces a mixture of pity, morbid anticipation, and a tiny, unacknowledged flicker of respect for her sheer audacity. They were expecting a show, a spectacle of failure. They were waiting to see a terrified girl and a furious, untamable horse, and they wanted front-row seats to the inevitable disaster. Tempest was already living up to his name. He was a storm of contained, violent energy, pacing the confines of the sturdy wooden pen like a caged panther. His powerful muscles rippled under his dark coat, and he would periodically lash out with his hind legs, kicking the thick wooden planks with a force that made the entire structure shudder and groan. The sound was like a series of gunshots, a clear and terrifying warning to the world. The two seasoned stable hands who were supposed to help the riders saddle their horses stood outside the pen, their arms crossed, their faces pale. They had drawn the short straw, assigned to the suicide mission of helping with Tempest. They took one look at the furious, 1,500-pound animal on the other side of the gate and shook their heads in unison. "No way, kid," one of them said, his voice firm as Lila approached. "We're not going in there. That's not a horse. That's a killer. It's your funeral." The other man just nodded in agreement, taking a deliberate step back from the gate. They were paid to handle rough stock, not to sign their own death warrants. Lila didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply gave them a small, tight nod of understanding. She had known she would be on her own. She unlatched the heavy wooden gate, its hinges groaning in protest, and slipped inside the pen, closing it quietly but firmly behind her. She was now locked in with the storm. She didn't carry a whip. She didn't wear spurs. All she had were her father's old, worn leather riding gloves, which she now pulled on. The familiar feel of the soft, cracked leather a comforting, tangible link to him. And she had the memory of his words, a silent mantra repeating in her mind. Not with force, but with understanding. The moment the gate latched, Tempest stopped his frantic pacing. He spun around to face her, a formidable wall of muscle and fury. His head was high, his nostrils flared, and his ears were pinned back so flat against his skull they almost disappeared. A low, threatening rumble, the sound of a gathering earthquake, vibrated deep in his chest. His dark eyes, usually so intelligent and soft when her father was around, were now wild with fire and suspicion. He was challenging her, daring her to make a move, ready to unleash the full force of his power against this small, fragile intruder. But Lila didn't flinch. She didn't try to approach him with a false bravado. She didn't try to corner him or assert her dominance. She simply stood her ground, just inside the gate, and held his fiery gaze. She took a deep, calming breath, letting it out slowly, trying to still the frantic beating of her own heart. And then she began to speak. Her voice was quiet, a soft, gentle murmur that was almost stolen by the wind, a sound so low it was meant only for him, an intimate secret in the midst of 1,000 watching eyes. She didn't talk about the race. She didn't issue commands. She didn't talk about riding or saddles or winning. She talked about her father. She spoke his name, John, and at the sound of it, the horse's ears twitched, a barely perceptible flicker. She reminded Tempest of the gentle, calloused hands that had raised him from a foal, of the soft off-key songs John used to hum while brushing his coat until it shone like polished jet. She spoke of the long, quiet rides they used to take through the canyons at sunrise, just the three of them. She spoke of their shared loss, of the gaping, hollow emptiness he had left behind in both their lives, a wound that had never properly healed. She let her own grief pour out, not in loud sobs, but in the quiet, aching sadness of her voice. "He believed in you, Tempest," she whispered, the words catching in her throat as tears finally welled in her eyes. But her voice remained steady, a lifeline of sincerity. "He told me you weren't wild. He said you were just sad. Just like me." She took a small, hesitant step forward. The horse held his ground, watching her, listening. "I'm not here to break you. I'm not here to conquer you. I'm just here to keep a promise." For him. And then slowly, miraculously, the storm began to subside. The tension that held the great horse's body so rigid began to drain away, like water seeping into dry earth. His ears, which had been pinned back in anger and aggression, flickered again, then softened, swiveling forward in an attitude of listening. The low growl in his chest subsided into a soft, questioning nicker. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another, his movements no longer threatening, but cautious and inquisitive. He lowered his massive head, a gesture of submission and trust he had not offered to another human in over a year. He extended his nose, his breath warm against her cheek, and gently, so gently, he nudged her shoulder. In that moment, in the sacred silent space between a grieving girl and a grieving horse, an understanding was reached. It was a silent conversation of shared memory and shared pain, a language of the heart that no one in the watching crowd could possibly hear or comprehend. The partnership her father had dreamed of was just beginning to form. Now, before we see what happens when that chute gate flies open and this impossible pair faces the world, we need you to do something. If you believe in the power of promises, if you believe in the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, and if you believe a daughter's love can conquer all, then prove it. Hit that subscribe button right now. Don't wait, don't hesitate. Become part of our community by subscribing, because you are about to witness a moment of trust, courage, and pure, unadulterated heart that will give you goosebumps and stay with you long after the video ends. The world outside the holding pen seemed to fade away into an indistinct blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. For Lila and Tempest, only the small circle of dusty ground they shared existed. With a trust that defied all logic and expectation, the great horse, Tempest, stood as still as a mountain. The storm within him had passed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving calm. He allowed Lila to approach, to run her small hand along his powerful neck, a touch he had not accepted from anyone since her father's death. He lowered his head, his soft, intelligent eyes watching her every move, not with suspicion, but with a deep, knowing acceptance. He had heard her. He had understood. With movements that were slow, deliberate, and filled with a reverence that was almost prayer-like, Lila began to prepare him. She gently placed her father's old, worn saddle blanket on his broad back. The horse didn't even flinch. Then came the saddle itself, a heavy, ornate piece of leather that was a famous icon of her father's career. She lifted it, straining with the weight, and carefully settled it onto his back. He shifted his weight slightly to accept it, a subtle but clear sign of cooperation. The crowd, which had been a low murmur of disbelieving whispers, was now completely and utterly silent. The laughter was a distant, shameful memory. The mockery had evaporated. In its place was a stunned, disbelieving awe. Every single person in the stands, from the most cynical old rancher to the youngest child, was witnessing the impossible. They were watching a 16-year-old girl single-handedly saddle a horse that grown men, professional trainers with decades of experience, had publicly declared to be untamable and lethally dangerous. The stable hands who had refused to enter the pen now clung to the fence, their mouths agape, their faces a mask of pure astonishment. This wasn't just horsemanship. It was something else entirely, something they had never seen before. Lila tightened the cinch, her movements sure and practiced, a muscle memory from 1,000 times she had watched her father do the same. Tempest let out a soft sigh, a puff of warm air, but did not move. Finally, with her heart pounding a rhythm of fear and exhilarating hope, Lila gathered the reins, placed her foot in the stirrup, and swung herself up onto his back. For a moment the world seemed to tilt as she settled into the familiar, deep-set saddle. She was small, almost fragile atop the mountain of black muscle, but she sat tall, her posture a perfect echo of her father's championship form. She was home. She leaned forward, her lips close to Tempest's ear, the scent of the horse familiar and comforting. "Okay, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is it. For Dad?" She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the gatekeeper. The entire rodeo ground held its collective breath. The air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like you could taste it. And then, with a loud clang of metal on metal, the chute gate flew open. What happened next was not the violent, chaotic explosion of rage everyone had been braced for. It was not a desperate girl clinging to a bucking, spinning demon. It was something far more powerful. It was something far more beautiful. It was poetry in motion. Tempest surged out of the chute and into the sun-drenched arena not with blind, furious rage, but with a focused, breathtaking, explosive power that was perfectly controlled. He moved with a fluid, effortless grace that seemed impossible for a creature of his immense size and strength. And Lila, the small girl they had all laughed at, was not just a passenger holding on for dear life. She was a part of him. She was an extension of his will. Her small, light frame moved in perfect harmony with his powerful strides, her body a seamless counterpoint to his every move. She wasn't fighting him. She was guiding him with the lightest of touches on the reins, with subtle shifts in her own weight, a silent language that only they understood. They weren't fighting each other. They were dancing, a wild, beautiful, and powerful dance of shared memory and singular purpose. The other riders in the race, seasoned professionals on highly trained horses, became a blur in the background. They were just men on horses, competing for a prize. Lila and Tempest were a legend come to life, a father's final lesson made manifest. They thundered toward the first barrel, a chaotic part of the race that usually involved jostling and sharp, aggressive turns. But Tempest moved through the pack with the intelligence of a master strategist, finding a clear path where there was none. They rounded the barrel in a turn so sharp, so low to the ground, that it seemed to defy the very laws of physics. Lila leaned into the turn, her body perfectly aligned with his, a single unified entity moving at impossible speed. The crowd, which had been silent in its shock, was now on its feet. A collective gasp had been replaced by a rising roar of disbelief and wonder. Their mockery and doubt were completely forgotten, washed away by the sheer, undeniable spectacle unfolding before them. They were watching more than just a horse race. They were watching a daughter channel the very spirit of her legendary father, proving that his greatest lesson wasn't in how to dominate an animal, but in how to listen to its heart. They were watching a promise being fulfilled with every powerful, earth-shaking stride. They flew around the second barrel, and then the third, their movements a flawless execution of speed, trust, and partnership. They were so far ahead of the other riders that it no longer felt like a competition. It was a demonstration. As they turned for the final straight sprint to the finish line, Lila leaned low over Tempest's neck, her face buried in his flying mane, and let him run. And he ran. He ran with the heart of a champion that had been dormant for a year. He ran for the man who had raised him, and for the girl who had believed in him. As they thundered across the finish line, lengths ahead of anyone else, a split second of pure, profound silence hung in the arena. It was a silence of absolute awe. And then the stadium erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a deafening, cathartic roar of respect, of apology, and of pure, unadulterated admiration. No one was laughing now. Down in the front rows, the grizzled old ranchers who had mocked her were on their feet, their hats held over their hearts, their weathered faces streaked with tears. They had laughed at a little girl, but they were cheering for a queen. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over the arena, but for Lila it was a distant, muffled echo. In the immediate, breathless aftermath of crossing the finish line, her entire world had narrowed to the magnificent horse beneath her. Tempest slowed from his thunderous gallop to a canter, then a trot, and finally came to a stop in the center of the dusty arena, his sides heaving, his dark coat gleaming with sweat, but his head held high, a king reclaiming his throne. Lila's legs felt like jelly, trembling with adrenaline and overwhelming emotion. With a grace that belied her exhaustion, she slid off Tempest's back, her boots landing softly in the dirt. The moment her feet touched the ground, she didn't look at the cheering crowd or the stunned judges. She turned and wrapped her arms around Tempest's powerful, sweaty neck, burying her face in his mane. It smelled of dust, sweat, and home. "We did it," she whispered, her voice choked with tears she could no longer hold back. "We did it, Dad." The great horse, the untamable beast that men had feared, responded with a gentleness that brought a fresh wave of tears to the eyes of those watching. He lowered his massive head and nudged her softly, a gesture of profound partnership and affection. He rested his head on her small shoulder, a quiet, comforting weight, and let out a long, contented sigh. In the heart of the roaring stadium, they stood together in their own silent bubble of shared victory and shared grief. A girl and her horse, a daughter and her father's legacy, finally united as one. The judges, officials, and rodeo queens approached them, their faces filled with an awe and respect that bordered on reverence. The grizzled old rodeo president, a man who had been a fierce rival of her father's, took the grand champion's trophy, a large gleaming silver cup, and held it out to her. His own eyes were suspiciously bright. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would have been so damn proud of you, kid. We all are." That day, Lila didn't just win a horse race. She had accomplished something far greater. She had fulfilled a sacred promise. In doing so, she had healed her own fractured heart. And in a beautiful, perfect circle, she had healed the grieving spirit of a magnificent horse that everyone else in the world had given up on. She had proven, on the grandest stage, that her father's final lesson was his most important one. True strength, true mastery, wasn't about dominance or force. It was about empathy. It was about patience. It was about having the courage to listen, really listen, to a soul that is in pain, and to offer understanding instead of a whip. The cruel laughter of the crowd had been a painful, refining fire, but she had walked through it and emerged not burned, but forged into something stronger, something purer. She had her father's skill, but she had her own unique brand of strength. The story of that ride became an instant legend. It was the talk of the rodeo circuit, then the state, and then the country. Lila and Tempest became a celebrated duo, but their fame was unique. They went on to win championships, their speed and skill undeniable. But they were known less for the trophies they collected, and more for the incredible, almost telepathic bond they shared. Spectators would come not just to see them win, but to watch the quiet moments before the race. The way Lila would talk to Tempest, the way the great horse would lower his head to listen, the palpable aura of trust and mutual respect that surrounded them. They became a symbol of hope, a living testament to her father's enduring wisdom. They were proof that the most difficult, most broken souls often have the most to give, if only someone is brave enough to offer them a gentle hand instead of a closed fist. Lila used her winnings and her newfound fame to transform her family's ranch. She established the John Ryder Memorial Foundation, a center for troubled horses and troubled kids, a place where the principles of trust and understanding were the foundation of all training. She taught young, aspiring riders that communication was more powerful than control, that partnership was more valuable than prizes. She took in horses that others had deemed useless or dangerous, and with a patience that seemed boundless, she found the broken pieces of their spirits and helped put them back together. The legend of her father, the great champion, was slowly and beautifully intertwined with a new legend. The story of the girl who silenced the world's laughter. It was a story that parents would tell their children, a reminder that courage comes in all sizes, that the doubts of the world are no match for a determined heart, and that love is the most powerful tool of all. Years later, When Lila was herself a celebrated champion and a respected mentor, she would often stand by Tempest's pasture in the quiet of the evening. The great horse, now old and gray around the muzzle, would walk over and rest his head on her shoulder, just as he had done in the arena all those years ago. She had saved him from a life of lonely, angry isolation, and he, in turn, had saved her. He had given her a purpose, a path, and had allowed her to fulfill her father's last wish, proving that the greatest legacies are not etched in stone or cast in silver, but are carried forward in the hearts of those we love. If this story of courage, love, and redemption touched your heart, please share it with someone in your life who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, even if they feel small, and that the world's doubts can never extinguish the fire of a determined spirit. And if you haven't already, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single one of our upcoming stories. We are dedicated to bringing you more incredible tales that prove the most beautiful victories are the ones that are won not for a trophy, but for love, for honor, and for a promise that could not be broken. Thank you for watching.